music, we have to see how the two texts reverberate together and what their relationship is to one another and what this means for Hebrew and Israeli music as a whole. So what does it mean? It's tempting in the final analysis to speak of the dualistic character of Idelsohn's Hebrew music, especially given the focus of my talk that there are these two iconic texts, and one is cosmopolitan and one is romantic essentialist nationalism or something of that sort. In this, we could follow the lead of one of Idelsohn's most famous students, the legendary composer Idelsohn, who once recalled that, quote, for Idelsohn, there was a barrier between his national research on Oriental music and his, parentheses, aesthetic or artistic love for Western music. But I think this is a misreading, because Idelsohn's Hebrew music is more than an awkward set of conflicting, contradictory impulses. I would argue it's a self-conscious blend of the two, a deliberate confluence. His true significance lies not in his idealistic promotion of the myth of the East, or his ironic justification of the West, but in the pursuit of a rapprochement between East and West, between Hebrew ethnic primordialism and European aesthetic cosmopolitanism. And this, I would suggest, is his larger aesthetic legacy within Israeli music as a whole. Writing of the post-1960s Israeli rock and popular music scene, Moti Rega suggests that the best way to understand these Israeli musical genres is by reference to a notion of, quote, dual authenticity, a term he defines as a simultaneous mixture of the local and the cosmopolitan. Israeli musicians, Regev explains, strive to create a genuinely Israeli identity, hence local, that also helps integrate them into a larger global musical culture, cosmopolitan. In essence, the same dynamic is visible in the idea of Hebrew music as it emerges in Idelsohn's work in the second Aliyah period. His was a quest to be culturally distinctive, yet globally relevant. By deploying this Hebrew musical ideal in such different forms, he reinforces the ideal of dual authenticity in this new notion of Musika Ivrit, Hebrew music. In this respect, recovering the legacy of Idelsohn's notion of Hebrew music may help to resolve part of the puzzle of the curious persistence of the Hebrew moniker in Israeli music and the attendant ambiguities and confusion about its meaning. Here we come finally to the questions of the confused relationship between Jewish music and Israeli music in the pre- and post-1948 periods of Israeli cultural history. In his seminal essay on the semiotics of Hebrew culture, Itamar Eben Zohar concludes that with the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, and increasingly so in later decades, the symbolic battle against diasporic Jewish culture ended, obviating the need to define Hebrew culture in opposition to it. As he says, Hebrew culture in Palestine has become Israeli, and although the latter definitely springs from the previous stage, it seems very different from it. In other words, the success of Hebrew culture as an ideological stage in the formation of Hebrew culture, Israeli culture, ensures its own eventual obsolescence. Such a conclusion may hold true for Israeli literature, again defined by the powerful force of language, but it's not at all clear that the same can be said of music. The obvious retention and reinterpretation of Hebrewness in Israeli musical culture, demonstrated above all in the retention of terms such as Hebrew music and Hebrew song, points to a more complicated dynamic. Hebrew still denotes a specific ideological thrust of a self-conscious aesthetic choice in relation to the past and present, native and foreign, diaspora Jewish and Israeli Zionist, while Israeli indicates a more neutral and broader sociological category of culture that is only implicitly national. One reason for this trend may lie in the earliest origins of Hebrew music, as evidenced by the case of Idelsohn, in which heterogeneity and homogeny, aesthetic cosmopolitanism, and purist essentialism are explicitly thrust together into a model of national culture that draws on the creative tension between these two deeply rooted impulses. This may also explain the core paradox at the heart of Israeli music. It continues to signify Israeliness to such a dramatic degree, yet at the same time arguably draws more deeply and explicitly than any other Israeli cultural genre on such an international language of styles, melodies, and artistic symbols. After all, its origins lie in the imagination of the man who would become the first Hebrew musician, Abraham Tzvi Idelsohn.
Thank you, Professor Loeffler. I hope you're taking notes. Of course, we take all the observations together. Our second speaker, Dr. Noah Gerber, whom I just met now for the first time, even though we have been in sort of communications. He just finished his dissertation.
Handed it in. hasn't been totally approved.
Okay, but
Careful
it's-
with the doctor.
But never mind, we can already call you doctor, I think, if you allow us. On the perception of Yemenite Jewish culture in general in the 19th century and early 20th century. And of course, he has a chapter on Idelsohn, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Gerber to deliver his speech. Thank you.
Many thanks to you, Professor Ceruzzi, as well as to my fellow panel members, Jim Loeffler and Judah Cohen, for inviting me to participate. The copy of Jewish music in its historical development that surfaced me in the Fairman's paper was presented to my mother exactly 4 decades ago, 40 years after its initial publication, upon her graduation from the Hebrew Art School in Manhattan, known today as the Elaine Kaufman Cultural Center, founded and directed by Dr. Tzipora Yoxberger, a scholar, educator, and composer of Jewish music in her own right. My mom, may she forgive me, is 40 years older than she was in 1969, while Idelsohn's classic has apparently reached the ripe old age of 80. Some 5 pages in the book are, no doubt, devoted to the musical heritage of the only Jewish community remaining in the Arabian Peninsula after the dawn of Islam. Having said that, your typical American Jewish reader would never have known that its author, an initially Litvische-trained Chazan, ardently secular Zionist, as well as eager student of German comparative musicology, was one of the better friends that the Yemenite Jews of Jerusalem had known before the coming of the Great War in Palestine. Zionist cultural memory has not been kind to Abraham Tzvi Idelsohn, to say the least. Having left this country permanently in 1921, his multifaceted attempt to create a musical culture that could befit the new Jew in his ancient homeland was quickly eclipsed by the more successful efforts taken in that direction by a specific branch of the Russian school of Jewish music that became fully entrenched in the Yishuv not so long after his final departure. Upon arriving in Jerusalem in early 1907, Idelsohn was quite convinced that he could reconstruct the sounds and melodies once sung by the Levites in the ancient Jewish temple. For his neighbor, Boris Schatz, founding the arts and crafts school Bitzalel 1 year earlier, had been a similar exercise in a very nationalist, not to mention secular undertaking of a symbolic rebuilding of the temple, if you will. Both these practitioners of cultural Zionism in the realm of aesthetics employed Yemenites in their respective and artistic projects. The father of Israeli art had his students draw and sculpt the features of many a Jew hailing from Arabia Felix. The latter also populated the production line of a new national style of Judaica stemming from the heart of Zion, which he, Schatz, sought to market abroad. Unlike Schatz, however, Idelsohn was a one-man show without institutional backing during his Palestinian sojourn. Nevertheless, it was during this unstable period of his scholarly life that the father of Jewish ethnomusicology managed to lay down the spadework for his multi-volume Thesaurus of Hebrew Oriental Melodies, the first of which was devoted to the Yemenite rite. What often goes unnoticed in the literature devoted to him is that while studying and recording Yemenite Jewish music in Jerusalem, Idelsohn became a first-hand ethnographer of Yemenite Jewry. When compared to the other Oriental Jewish communities in the Holy City, whose rites he so meticulously documented, the one of Yemenite provenance stands out in terms of the sheer amount of interest he showed in the non-musical contexts in which he had found it embedded. Some half a century earlier, a rabbinic emissary from Jerusalem named Jacob Sapir had spent the better part of a year in Yemen and its environs. This enabled him, Sapir, to describe a hitherto unknown Jewish way of life that on the one hand seemed alien and primitive to him, but on the other seemed much more authentic than the Ashkenazi and specifically Lithuanian way of life he was familiar with. The same more or less could be said of Idelsohn's feeling toward the Yemenite Jews he encountered in Jerusalem 5 decades later. Sapir was ritually observant, committed to a moderate form of East European Jewish enlightenment, or Haskalah, and also quite familiar with the traditional rabbinic canon. He therefore conversed with almost all of the rabbis as well as religious